April 29th, 1945, 7:30 a.m. The air in the Bavarian countryside is deceptively crisp, carrying the faint, sweet scent of pine and early spring blossoms. But for the men of the 45th Infantry Division, known as the Thunderbirds, the beauty of the landscape is a hollow mockery. These men are the walking dead of the American military. They have fought their way through the meat grinder of Sicily, survived the freezing mud of the Anzio beachhead, and clawed through the Vosges mountains in France. By the time they reached the German border, their souls were already frayed, worn down by years of watching their brothers evaporate in artillery bursts and vanish into the grey mists of combat. They are not the shiny, polished soldiers from the recruitment posters. They are hollowed-out versions of the boys who left Oklahoma and Texas years ago. They are tired, they are filthy, and they are nursing a quiet, simmering resentment toward a world that has forced them to witness the absolute worst of humanity. As they approach the outskirts of a small town called Dachau, just 10 miles from the cultural jewel of Munich, they believe they are entering another routine mopping-up operation. Intelligence reports suggest a large industrial complex, possibly a supply depot or a slave labor factory. They expect a fight, but they expect a professional one. They have no idea that in less than 60 minutes, the last remnants of their own humanity will be tested and shattered in a way that no training manual could ever prepare them for. They reach a railroad spur, a set of rusted tracks that disappear behind a high concrete wall topped with electrified barbed wire. Sitting on those tracks is a train. It consists of 39 cattle cars, silent and motionless in the morning fog. There is no steam from the engine, no sound of shifting cargo, just an eerie, heavy silence that makes the hair on the back of the soldiers' necks stand up. A young lieutenant from Oklahoma named Jack Bushyhead, a man with Cherokee blood and eyes that have seen too much death, signals his squad to move forward. The smell hits them first. It isn't the smell of gunpowder or grease. It is a thick, sweet, heavy stench of rot that clings to the back of the throat and refuses to let go. Bushyhead reaches for the iron latch of the nearest car. He slides the heavy wooden door open, expecting to find crates of ammunition or food. Instead, he is met by a wall of human misery, so dense it defies the laws of physics. Inside the car are bodies, hundreds of them, stacked like cordwood. These are not soldiers killed in battle. These are skeletons covered in a thin layer of translucent skin, their eyes wide and staring into a void that the American soldiers cannot comprehend. These people had been evacuated from Buchenwald 4 days earlier, left in these cars without food, without water, and without air. In the corners of the cars, the living are still there, huddled among the dead. They are too weak to scream, too far gone to cheer. They simply look at the American uniforms with a vacant, terrifying pleading. Some of the corpses have bite marks on their arms where the living try to eat the dead to survive. The American soldiers, hardened veterans who have seen friends blown apart in foxholes, react with a primal, visceral shock. A 19-year-old private drops his rifle in the snow and begins to vomit until his stomach is empty and he is dry heaving bile. Another soldier, a man who survived the bloody hills of Italy, sits down on the rusted tracks and begins to cry, a hollow, rhythmic sobbing that echoes off the wooden sides of the death train. But as the initial shock fades, a new emotion takes its place. It is a cold, vibrating, murderous rage. This is not the rage of combat. This is the rage of the Avenger. They look at the SS watchtowers in the distance, seeing the clean, well-fed guards peering down through binoculars. They look at the high walls of the camp and realize that this train is just the foyer of a mansion of horror. In that moment, the Geneva Convention, the very rules of war they were sworn to uphold, ceases to exist. The international law that protects prisoners of war becomes a meaningless piece of paper in the face of 39 cars of murdered innocents. This is the declassified story of the Dachau Liberation Reprisals. It is the day the liberators became the executioners. It is the story of the Coal Yard Massacre, the revenge of the walking skeletons, and the secret investigation that General George S. Patton would eventually burn to cinders to protect his men from the gallows. To understand why the Thunderbirds snapped, you have to understand the context of the 45th Division's journey. They had been in continuous combat for over 500 days. They had seen the brutality of the SS on the front lines, where American prisoners were often found with their hands tied behind their backs and a bullet in the base of their skulls. They were already primed to hate the black uniformed guards of the Reich. When they entered the main gate of Dachau, they were greeted by what looked like an army of ghosts. 30,000 prisoners, the survivors of the first and longest-running concentration camp in Nazi Germany, rushed toward the fences. They were weeping, screaming in a dozen different languages, and reaching out with claw-like hands to touch the olive-drab paint of the American tanks. The soldiers looked into the barracks and found more bodies, piled in the hallways, rotting in the bunks. They found the crematorium where the ovens were still radiating a sickening heat, the white ash of human remains still visible on the iron grates. They found the torture room where the walls were stained with old blood and the ceiling was fitted with hooks where men were hung until their shoulders dislocated. The commander of the SS garrison, a young lieutenant named Heinrich Wicker, stepped out from behind a building with a white flag of truce. He was the picture of Aryan Perfection. His uniform was pressed, his boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his face was clean and well-fed. He expected to be treated with the professional respect due to a surrendering officer. He walked up to the Americans, gave a crisp salute, and said in perfect German, "I surrender this camp to the United States Army." An American officer, his face blackened by the soot of the crematorium and his eyes red with fury, looked at Wicker's clean face, then looked at the pile of 2,000 rotting corpses on the train just a few hundred yards away. He didn't return the salute. He didn't take the surrender. He spat in the German's face and told his men to move the bastard to the rear with the others. The order was never officially given, but a silent consensus had been reached among the men of the 45th. There would be no prisoners today. About 50 SS guards were herded into a coal yard behind the camp's powerhouse. They were lined up against a high brick wall, their hands raised, their voices trembling as they began to realize that their magic white flag was not going to save them. They started shouting about the Geneva Convention, pleading for their lives, claiming they were just following orders. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead looked at his men. He saw the trauma that had just permanently altered their brains. He saw the faces of 19-year-old kids who would never be able to go back to a normal life after seeing the death train. He gestured to a machine gunner nicknamed Bird Eye. The sound of the .30 caliber machine gun being cocked was the only sound in the yard. It was a heavy, mechanical click that signaled the end of the world for the men against the wall. For 10 seconds, the machine gun roared, a continuous, unrelenting stream of lead that cut the SS guards down in waves. The brick wall behind them was peppered with holes and splashed with crimson. Those who didn't die in the first burst were finished off with M1 Garans as they lay twitching in the black coal dust. The liberators stood over the bodies, their faces blank and frozen. They felt no guilt. They felt no regret. They only felt a grim, mathematical sense of balance. 50 dead monsters for 30,000 murdered souls. But the Americans were not the only ones looking for blood. The prisoners, the men who had been dehumanized and tortured for years, wanted their pound of flesh. As the American guards looked the other way, the survivors of Dachau swarmed the remaining SS men. They dragged them into the barracks where the smell of typhus and death was strongest. They used shovels, they used sticks, they used their bare hands. They tore the men who had been their masters into pieces with a ferocity that shocked even the combat-hardened GIs. They found a German capo, a prisoner who had worked for the Nazis and beaten his fellow inmates, and they drowned him in a latrine while the American soldiers smoked cigarettes and watched. For 1 hour, Dachau was a lawless zone of primal vengeance, a place where the victim became the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and the United States Army simply let it happen. When the news of the massacre reached the higher echelons of the military command, the army was terrified. This was a public relations nightmare in the making. The Allies were supposed to be the moral crusaders, the light of democracy. If word got out that American soldiers were executing prisoners in cold blood, it would hand the Nazi propaganda machine a final, desperate weapon. A formal investigation was launched by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker. He arrived at Dachau while the bodies in the coal yard were still warm. He interviewed the soldiers, he took meticulous photos of the executed guards, and he wrote a report that recommended general court-martials for every American officer involved, including Lieutenant Bushyhead. The report was damning. It used the word murder repeatedly and characterized the 45th Division as a unit that had lost its discipline and its soul. But then, the report traveled up the chain of command until it landed on the heavy oak desk of General George S. Patton. Patton was the commander of the Third Army, a man who usually demanded that his soldiers polish their boots and salute with precision. He was a strict disciplinarian who had once slapped a soldier for having a breakdown. But Patton was also a man who understood the reality of the front line. He read the file. He looked at the photos of the death train and the piles of skeletal remains. He looked at the faces of his boys in the 45th Division, boys he had led through the fires of hell. Patton called the SS the slime of the earth. He summoned the investigating officer into his office and held up the report. "What is this garbage?" Patton growled. The officer replied that it was evidence of a war crime. Patton didn't even blink. He looked the officer in the eye and said, "You walk into a place like that, you see 2,000 dead bodies on a train, and you expect my boys to follow a rule book? Hell no, these men were overwrought. They did what any man with a heart would do." In one of the most controversial and legally questionable acts of his career, Patton took the investigation file and he burned it. Or, as some sources suggest, he ordered it to be buried so deep in the top-secret archives that it would never see the light of day. He told his staff, "There will be no trial. The SS got what they deserved. Case closed, dismissed." The charges were dropped. The secret was buried under layers of military bureaucracy. The men of the 45th Division went home to Oklahoma and Texas and Ohio, carrying the invisible scars of that day. They were hailed as heroes, given parades and medals, but in the dark of night, they were the men who had looked into the abyss and realized the abyss was looking back. The Dachau Reprisals remain the most uncomfortable chapter of the Allied victory because they force us to confront a terrifying truth, that there is no such thing as a clean war. Even the most righteous cause requires people to do unrighteous things. When you confront pure evil, you cannot remain a professional soldier. You either become a victim or an avenger. The history books like to present the greatest generation as uncomplicated icons of virtue, and in many ways they were. But the declassified files show us that even the greatest generation had to lose their humanity for an hour to save it for a lifetime. Today, at the Dachau Memorial, there is a chapel and a museum dedicated to the 30,000 victims who suffered behind those walls. But there is no marker for the 50 men who died against the brick wall in the coal yard. They were the architects of a hell on earth, and on April 29, 1945, they met the devil wearing an American uniform. We must remember that war doesn't just kill people, it kills the capacity for mercy. The Thunderbirds did what they had to do, and General Patton made sure they didn't pay for it with their freedom, but they paid for it with their peace of mind. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw the 39 cattle cars. Every time they heard a machine gun, they remembered the sound of the .30 caliber cutting through the Bavarian mist. This is the cost of victory. This is the truth that the declassified files finally reveal. Justice is not always found in a courtroom with a judge and a jury. Sometimes justice is found in a coal yard with a machine gun and a general who knows when to look the other way. The end of the war was the beginning of the secrets, and the Dachau Reprisals were the biggest secret of them all. Until now. Declassified. Done. Delivered. The camp at Dachau is silent now. The ovens are cold, the watchtowers are empty, and the railroad tracks where the death train once sat are overgrown with tall grass and wildflowers. But the echo of those shots in the coal yard remains, a haunting reminder of a world that had seen too much. It is the sound of vengeance disguised as necessity. It is the sound of a secret that lasted a lifetime. The U.S. Army tried to forget, but the ghosts of the 45th Division refused to leave. They remind us that the line between hero and monster is as thin as a trigger pull, and that in the heat of liberation, even the best of men can become the worst of executioners. We must never forget the victims of the Holocaust, for their names are etched in stone. But we must also remember the men who had to become monsters to stop the madness. John C. Woods, George Patton, and the men of the Thunderbirds, they were all part of the same dark, twisted story. A story of a world that had gone insane. A story of a war that changed the definition of justice, and a story of the secrets we keep to remain civilized in the aftermath of hell. The declassified reality of Dachau is finally clear. We won the war, but we lost something in that coal yard that we can never get back. May we never have to face a death train again. And may we never have to trust our souls to a machine gun and a moment of righteous rage. The briefing is concluded. The secrets of the coal yard are revealed. Success is the only option, and the truth is the only legacy. This is WW2 Declassified. Moving to next mission, over and out. The shadows of the Dachau camp have finally been illuminated by the light of the truth. We see the man, the gun, and the anger. We see the heroes who became killers, and we see the dark heart of a victory that cost us everything. The 45th Infantry was a symptom of a world in pain, a unit that found its only response in the machinery of revenge. Let us remember them for what they were, human and broken, a warning about the cost of hate and the danger of the righteous executioner. The Dachau Reprisals, the Allied Massacre, the secret Patton burned, declassified and delivered. The truth is out. Now go make history, but tell it the right way, because the archives are watching and the victims are always waiting. This is the final word. The file is closed, signal lost, mission accomplished. The camp is quiet, the guards are gone, but the name Dachau will live on in the shadows of the Great War. The day the Allies became the executioners, the day they botched the end of the war to get a moment of blood. This is the declassified reality. This is the truth of the Dachau Reprisals. We will not forget. We will not look away. We will continue to uncover the secrets of the past, because that's what we do. We are the keepers of the history, the tellers of the truth, and the voices of the declassified. The world was a different place in 1945. The lines between right and wrong had been blurred by years of industrial-scale slaughter. When the men of the 45th Division walked into Dachau, they weren't just walking into a camp, they were walking into the physical manifestation of pure evil. It is easy for us, 80 years later, sitting in the comfort of our homes, to judge them for what they did in that coal yard. It is easy to talk about the rule of law and the Geneva Convention when you haven't seen 39 train cars full of dead children. But for the men who were there, the law was a luxury they couldn't afford. They saw a crime that demanded a response that the law wasn't designed to provide. They saw a world that had broken every promise of civilization, and they responded in kind. General Patton understood this. He was a man of the old world, a warrior who believed in the ancient laws of blood and honor. He knew that if he put those men on trial, he would be punishing them for being human. He would be punishing them for having a soul that could still be revolted by the sight of the death train. So he burned the papers. He protected the avengers, and in doing so, he became a part of the secret himself. The history of World War II is full of these moments where the heroes had to step into the dark to finish the job. We don't like to talk about them because they complicate the narrative of the good war. But there is no such thing as a good war. There are only necessary wars, and necessary wars are always dirty. The Dachau Reprisals were a dirty necessity for the men who carried them out. They needed to know that the monsters would pay. They needed to see the architects of hell fall. And once it was over, they needed to bury the truth so the rest of the world could keep believing in the dream of a civilized victory. This is why we declassify these files. Not to tear down the heroes, but to understand the weight they carried for us. To understand that the freedom we enjoy today was paid for not just with the lives of the soldiers, but with their innocence. The men of the Thunderbirds gave up their peace of mind so that the death train would never run again. Patton gave up his legal standing to protect his men. These are the choices that win wars. These are the choices that history tries to forget. But WW2 Declassified remembers. We remember the machine gun in the coal yard. We remember the match that burned the evidence. And we remember that in the heart of every hero, there is a shadow that only the declassified files can reveal. This is the final word on the Dachau liberation. A story of horror, rage, and the high cost of justice. Let it be a reminder that even in the brightest victory, there are corners of darkness that we must never stop exploring. Because that's where the truth lives, and the truth is the only thing that can truly set us free. WW2 Declassified. Out.